Hey everyone, welcome to the second to last session of PLMW, and in this session, Derek Dreyer is going to tell us about how to write papers and give talks that people can follow. So, thank you.
Hello everyone, can you hear me? Yes, great. Good afternoon. Are you still awake? Yes? Good, because I'm not. Hopefully we'll get through this. My name's Derek Dreyer. I'm a tenure track, not tenure track. I told you I was tired. I'm a tenured faculty member and a full-time researcher at the Max Planck Institute for Software Systems in Saarbrücken, which is a little small city in western Germany. As I was watching all these talks today, I noticed that almost everyone had a little introduction about themselves, which I had not put into my talk. So I don't have a long introduction for you. I have a very abbreviated introduction to this talk, which is just that I like whiskey. There's many things you might know about me. This is one of them. Some people like programming languages, some people like types. Okay, I like whiskey. So if you have questions about that, feel free to ask. And they're not usually on the floor. And also I have a blog called Dreyer, which has a number of. I haven't actually worked. I'm working on a blog post now, but I haven't worked on one in about a year, so it's a bit out of date. But there's some posts on there that have a sort of mentoring-ish feel that some people might enjoy taking a look at. Anyway, so as I said, I'm a full-time researcher, and you might think that being a full-time researcher means that that you get to do research full-time, but actually that's not the case. So I do research some of the time, and actually mostly I advise students on doing their research some of the time. And then once you've actually done some piece of research, you have to tell people about it, and that usually takes two forms. One is first turning that research into a paper that you submit to a conference like ICFP. And then if you're lucky enough to get it accepted, then going and giving a 20-minute talk at that conference. And today I'm going to be telling you about both of these things and trying to give you some guidance about ways in which you might give more effective written and spoken presentations of PL research. So I'm going to start by first presenting, for the first half or 2/3 of the talk, discussing writing papers, because for me that's sort of like the most fundamental mode of communication that we have, and then I'll spend the rest of the talk talking about giving talks. So starting with papers. So first a question to you. So how many of you have read any programming languages papers recently? Oh, okay, quite a few. And how many of you have thrown up your hands in despair at your inability to understand what the hell is going on? Oh, okay, good. Even more. Okay, that's good. So welcome to my world. So I'm a tenured faculty member. So I've been reading papers for a long time, and nevertheless, I still I'm totally confused half the time when I'm reading, especially when I'm reviewing papers for conferences like this. There was an animation. Okay, so you may think that the reason that you don't understand the papers is just that you're lacking the technical sophistication to understand what's going on, and maybe that's part of it. But in fact, the fact of the matter is many papers are just poorly written. Okay, most of a lot of the papers that you see actually get accepted to a conference like ICFP will be pretty well written, but still quite a few won't. So if you can actually overcome this problem, if you can write clear, accessible papers, then many great things will happen. Okay, people will actually enjoy reading your papers. They'll learn something from them, which is really ostensibly the reason you wrote them in the first place. They'll get accepted to conferences like ICFP in astronomically higher numbers. You'll have fame. Your work will have great impact. You'll make a lot of money. Well, okay, maybe not. But at least you'll have some success in your career, and you'll communicate. So how can you do this? Or rather, first, in order to understand how to write more clear and accessible papers, you have to understand what is the difficulty. And I think the key difficulty is this gap between the writer of the paper and the readers. So in the middle of this picture, you see a piece of research. Okay, this is something that the writer of the paper has created, this beautiful thing. And they want to tell the reader about it. Okay, so from the writer's perspective, they want to tell the reader all the gory details of what went into this thing, because that's what they're excited about. Okay, so they want to tell them something about, you know, the pre-axial gaskets, and I don't know, there's some reduction in the XPS latency of the bivalve, something like that. That's what really gets them going in the morning. You know? And the reader, on the other hand, is sitting there saying, okay, but what does it do? What is this thing for? Why should I care about it? Maybe if you can answer some of those questions, then maybe I might, you know, theoretically be interested in hearing something about the bivalve and the uptake inhibitors or whatever. Okay, so this is the key thing you have to think about is where you are when you're writing a paper, you're in a totally different place from where the reader is, and you have to somehow manage to bridge that gap. The good news is there are principles that you can follow that will help you write clearer and more readable prose and bridge that gap between the writer and the reader. And it's based on understanding how readers process information. Now, when I say principles of good writing, is there any sort of canonical text that any of you can think of that you might have heard of? A reference? Yeah?
William Trump's The Elements of Style.
The Elements of Style, exactly. Right, so The Elements of Style by Strunk and White. So this is by far the most commonly recommended text for people, for new writers or for people who are writing, for writing in general. And personally, I can't stand this book. Okay, so the reason I can't stand it is because the things that are presented in this book that are considered like the most deep and profound pieces of advice are things like be clear and omit needless words. And my feeling is that if you knew how to be clear and you knew which words were needless, you really wouldn't need this book. And so that's the less harmful advice in the book. Okay, that's at least okay. It's useless. There's also a bunch of advice that's just wrong. So I really don't recommend this book at all. Some people may disagree, but I think this book is really ideal. And instead, I'm going to try to teach you about some principles that I've found very useful in my own work that are constructive, which means that it's easy to check if your text satisfies these principles. And if it doesn't, then the principles will suggest ways of improving the text. It doesn't mean that this is a recipe for becoming a good writer. There's still a huge amount of work and practice, and it takes people years to really become good writers, but at least this gives you a way forward, a way of constructively improving your text. So that's what I'm going to talk about in this talk, and I just want to say the advice I'm giving you is not just something I made up. Okay, a lot of the ideas were inspired by several other references. So the most important one is Joseph Williams' book, Style Toward Clarity and Grace. This is a really nice book. I don't agree with everything in the book, but it's a very it presents a lot of the concepts I'm telling you about with a lot of interesting examples, and for me it was really eye-opening. That's not really a technical writing book. That's just a general writing book. Norman Ramsey has some course notes on learn technical writing in 2 hours per week. That's also I found very useful. And complementing both of those is a talk that you can find online that Simon Peyton-Jones has given. Some of you may have seen it already, called How to Write a Great Research Paper. That's more focused on sort of high-level structure of PL papers. So that's useful. That provides a lot of useful ideas as well. And I'll be taking some bits from all these. And it's also important for me to note that this talk, so this whole talk is, including the advice I'll give you about giving talks, has been developed jointly with my wife, Rose Hoberman, who teaches communication skills at the MPI for Software Systems, where I work. And she's been developing this kind of materials in much longer form. She teaches whole lectures over a semester about this for the past 9 years. So the first thing I'm going to focus on is lower level writing, and then we'll move to higher level structuring of PL papers a bit later. So we'll start with the low level writing of sentences and paragraphs. And the first principle I want to talk about is something called flow. So the idea of flow is very simple. It should be clear how each sentence and paragraph in your text relates to the adjacent ones. Okay? So that sounds kind of obvious, but apparently it's not obvious because many pieces of text that I read do not flow. So let's just look at one piece of text, and we'll see what we think about it. I'm going to read this. I'm going to read this aloud, and I want you to think about: is there a point in this text when you sort of lose the flow of the ideas? So, security proofs of cryptographic protocols are crucial for the security of everyday electronic communication. However, these proofs tend to be complex and difficult to get right. The game playing technique, originally proposed by Jones et al., follows a code-based approach where the security properties are formulated in terms of probabilistic programs called games. This is a general design principle for cryptographic proofs to ease their management. So, is there any point where this text starts to break down?
Game playing technique.
The game playing technique, okay, and why?
The sentence, well, the point of the sentence, the subject is changed. So it's getting back to the same point, but you deviate a bit.
You deviate somehow. Somehow you're talking about something new that's not clear how it relates to what came before. Right. So indeed, the problem is, what does this game playing technique have to do with what came before? And this happens all the time in papers that I read. So what can you do about it, or how can you identify what's the problem or what's the fix in a more systematic way? And the idea is very simple. It's something that we call the old to new principle. So it just the principle is just that you should be, in general, sentences should begin with old information and then move towards new information at the end. Okay. And that helps you to create a link between the earlier text, which is what you're referring to at the beginning of the sentence, and the new text, the new idea, which is what comes at the end. And it creates this kind of chain. And another nice thing about old to new is that it places the new information toward the end of the sentences, which is where sort of intuitively when we listen to sentences, that's where our ear places, or when we're reading, our eyes, place that's sort of position of emphasis where we put the weight of the sentence. And you want the weight of the sentence to go on the new thing you're trying to communicate. So looking back at this example again, right, the problem was precisely that the new information, as you identified it, right, the game playing technique, right, that's the new information, that was at the beginning of the sentence, right, so it came out of nowhere, and it wasn't clear how it connected to the previous sentences. So here's one way you could fix this, is to say, however these proofs tend to be complex and difficult to get right, to make it easier to manage such proofs, Jones et al. Have proposed a new design principle called the game playing technique. This technique follows a code-based approach where blah, 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 blah. Okay. And again, if you just now look at this revised paragraph, you can see that it follows old to new, right? The beginning of the second sentence talks about these proofs, which is referring back to the first sentence. Similarly, the beginning of the third sentence is, again, focusing on such proofs. And the new thing, which is the sort of the thing you want to actually present as a new thing in this paragraph, the game playing technique, that goes right at the end of the sentence, where it has this emphasis. Okay? Oh, by the way, I should have said at the beginning, if you have any questions, just, you don't have to wait, write them down on paper and wait till the end of the talk. Just ask them as we go along.
There's another good link here, Derek. To make it easier to manage, that's a reference back to the complex and difficult.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
It's an immediate segue.
Yes. Yes. Exactly. Okay, good. So that's flow, and that's for me one of the major problems. That's a sort of basic problem. If you don't have flow, the reader just gets very confused very quickly. But flow is not enough. Okay. So let's look at this other example to see an example of why that's the case. So again, I'll read this paragraph for you. Lions and tigers are some of the most dramatic and awe-inspiring species of cats. Most of these large cats, however, are currently facing extinction. A smaller cat that has been more evolutionarily successful is the house cat. Although house cats are currently the most popular pet in the world, they are in many ways antisocial. It would therefore be interesting to study whether house cats have been trained to be more social. Okay? So, what do you think about this text? Everything is wrong. That's true. Well, no, actually, that's not true. This text has great flow. Everything is not wrong. Right, that is actually the reason I use this text. But everything else is wrong. Yes. So what is the everything else? Yeah.
There is no central idea of this paragraph.
There's no central idea, exactly. It is incoherent. Okay. It flows fine, but then at the end of the day, you have no idea. The beginning and the end of the paragraph are on different planets. So, so this brings me to my second key idea in lower level writing, which is coherence. It should be clear how each sentence and paragraph in your text relates to the bigger picture. How each sentence relates to the bigger picture of the paragraph, how each paragraph relates to the bigger picture of the section, etc. And so how can you make that happen, or how can you check for that? So my suggestion is something called one paragraph, one point. So basically the idea is that a paragraph should have one main point. You're going to, of course, you can say several things, convey several bits of information, but there should be one central idea of the paragraph that you're trying to get across. And that should be expressed in a single sentence, which is called the point sentence. Now, there are different places you could put this point sentence, but for the vast majority of the time, at least in my own writing, I find it's easiest to place the point sentence at or near the beginning of the paragraph. And so if it's literally the first sentence, that's the easiest. That's what that's the easiest way to go. Sometimes you can't quite get to that point immediately. You have to take maybe 2 sentences to get to the point. But then that first 2 sentences, that's sort of like establishing the theorem of the paragraph, and the rest of the paragraph is kind of giving you the proof. So I think of this as kind of the theorem proof model of the paragraph. So looking back at the example, right, the problem was there was no point sentence. There was no one sentence in this paragraph that described the whole point, because there wasn't one. Okay. So what can you do about that? Well, so here's just, I basically had to rewrite that paragraph. It was a terrible paragraph. So here's one thing you could say. There appears to be a negative correlation between the charisma of a species and its ability to survive. That's a good point. Lions and tigers, for instance, are among the most majestic creatures in the animal kingdom, yet they are currently facing extinction. In contrast, the house cat is evolutionarily quite successful, even though it is mostly known for stupid petting. Okay, that's a very that has one theorem and then 2 sentences that are supporting that theorem. Okay, so again, this is a principle you can check for. You can look through the sentences in the paragraph and say, is there any one sentence that you could use as the representative of this paragraph if you were giving a sort of outline of the text? Okay, so that's flow and coherence, and as I said, these are, like, for me, the 2 most important things in low-level writing. There's a couple other principles that that I find also very useful. I'm not going to elaborate on them for time, but I just wanted to mention them. So one of them is what I call name your baby. This came from Norman Ramsey's notes. I can't remember exactly what he called it, but I like the name your baby. The idea is that you should give unique names to things that you refer to frequently, and you should use those unique names consistently. Right, and so this comes up a lot I find this often comes up in papers, especially collaborative papers, when I'm working with other researchers and writing different sections of the paper. Often, there's some central idea, and whoever's writing a certain section will just give that idea some name, or will refer to it in a certain way, and then you'll have one section of the paper that refers to it one way, and other sections that refer to it in a different way. And then as you're reading it, you're like, what is it? You just read about this one section about this particular concept, and then suddenly there's a new thing, and you don't realize that they're actually talking about the same thing. So very frequently when I'm writing papers, I have to go sort of check the whole paper for name your baby to make sure that the names are used consistently. The other thing is just in time. So again, this is, I find, a very common problem, particularly in student writing, that you want to give information, especially sort of more technical information, only when it's needed, not before. A lot of writers, I find, tend to sort of front load the paper with too much technical information about certain points just because they think, well, the reader needs to know this at some point, right? They're going to need to know this, so I might as well tell them now. No. You only tell the reader sort of more detailed information at the point where they absolutely need to know it in order to continue. Right? And so those are my 2 other principles I highly recommend. Okay. So moving on to higher level structure. How do you structure a research paper? For me, the high level I'm going to go into detail about how specifically I recommend structuring, how specifically I recommend structuring a PL paper in particular. But there's a high level idea running through this structure that's going to be relevant to other things I talk about later in this talk. And that idea is top down. Okay. So you want to always think about explaining your work. When you're explaining complex ideas, you're going to need to explain them more than once, and at different levels of abstraction, starting at a high level and getting progressively more detailed. Okay, and this is the best way to sort of another word for top down that I've heard is the spiral model. You sort of start by explaining the idea, and then you start again with more detail, and then more detail, and more detail. And this way, you're sort of building scaffolding in the mind of the reader, so that they know that there's going to be this idea that they need to understand, and they sort of know what it's about, and then they keep filling in the details as you go along. So that's like the basic, very high level idea. Now, how does this practically get turned into a paper structure? Well, so here's a structure that I use, or I try to use. I'll get back to that point in a sec. I can go in a few minutes. This is a structure that if you can make it works really well. And this is sort of the essence of top-down. So the idea is you start with the abstract. Okay, all papers have to have an abstract, they're like 1 or 2 paragraphs. An intro, let's say about 1 or 2 pages. A key ideas section, I'll come back to that. I'm going to go into much more detail about that later. Which is sort of describing the key ideas you're trying to get across in the paper. Technical meat, which is sort of filling in all the technical details, and then concluding with some related work, or detailed comparison of related work. So you can see the main point that this achieves is top-down. You start with the abstract, that's sort of like the smallest possible explanation of the contribution of the paper. Then you go to the intro, which goes into somewhat more detail. Then you go into the key ideas, which really gets into the contribution in a meaningful way. And then you have the technical meat, which has all the gory details, right? So it's really explaining the same thing at different levels of abstraction. Now, I'm going to talk about 4 of these sections in this paper, today. Which one do you think I'm not going to talk about? Why?
Because it's less important.
Why is it less important?
Number of readers.
Only 5 readers, yeah. So, yeah, I mean, this is maybe an exaggeration, but probably not. There's a good chance that, you know, if you write a paper, even if it gets accepted to a major conference, there's only probably going to be about 5 people in the world who are really going to read that technical meat section in detail and care about the details. However, you may get many, many more readers who will read your intro, or your key ideas, or your related work. So yeah, I'm going to not talk about technical meat. Also because it's very hard to talk about, to give sort of general guidance on how to write such a section. Yeah. So let's start with the abstract and the intro. And I'm going to start by talking about the abstract. The basic principles of writing a good abstract, I think, are also relevant to writing a good intro. So the way I write an abstract or intro is using something I call the CGI model. As I'll mention in a minute, there's other ways of setting up an intro. But this is, for me, what has usually worked. And this, again, is kind of in the following this idea of top-down. Sort of thinking about where is the reader and how can I bring them closer to what I want them to know. So CGI stands for Context Gap Innovation. The idea is that you begin by setting the stage. You sort of motivate what is the general topic you're working on. This usually is pretty short, okay, maybe a paragraph or 2 at most. Just to sort of clue the reader into, oh yeah, okay, this is a paper about whatever, okay. Sort of giving the general topic of the paper. It should not be too general, right? You don't want to just start, I can't tell you how many papers I've seen that say something like, that start out with, concurrent programs are notoriously hard to verify, or something like this. Right, so this looks like you just phoned it in. Okay, you want to have something that is a bit more relevant to the specific topic you're writing about, not so broad that everyone's like yawning. But you want to have something, I think, to sort of set the stage. Then you want to quickly move to the gap, which is what is the specific problem you're solving, and why does existing work not solve it, or at least not solve it well enough, so that it motivates why your paper should be is worth reading. Okay, and the important thing is here you have to really hone in and clearly explain what is the specific problem. A lot of papers I find just sort of they ramble on about sort of general problems, and it never becomes exactly clear what is the problem that this paper is solving. Then once you've explained that specific problem, then you move to innovation, where you say you state what you've done that's actually new, and clearly connect it to the gap that you've set up. So don't just sort of another common rookie mistake is to sort of give the details about state the gap, and then state the contributions, and then the reader's like, well, exactly how is this contribution related to the gap? You don't want the reader to have to connect the dots. You want to connect the dots very explicitly for the reader. Okay, so just to give you an instance of this, it's hard to give long examples from papers. I'll just give you sort of an abstract for this talk that I'm giving you today. Or actually, that's really for the writing part of this talk. So, context. Learning to write well is an essential part of becoming a successful researcher. Unfortunately, many researchers find it very hard to write well because they do not know how to view their text from the perspective of the reader. In this talk, we present a simple set of principles for good writing based on an understanding of how readers process information. Unlike such platitudes as be clear or omit needless words, our principles are constructive. One can easily check whether a piece of text satisfies them and blah, blah, blah. Okay. So, so the point was, there were very clear sentences that you could point to that said, this is the context, this is the gap, this is the innovation. Okay. And having those clearly separated out into distinct sentences just helps focus the reader on, okay, here's where I'm going. Now, having said that, so that's for an abstract. For me, an introduction is generally very similar. Okay, it's going to be quite a bit longer, not too long, but 1 or 2 pages, and it follows that same. I tend to follow that same model. An alternative approach that Simon, who's here today, has advocated in his talk is basically skipping the context and instead starting right away with a concrete example, getting right into So a lot of his papers will start, bam, consider this Haskell code. Okay, and then here's some example that illustrates the point. If this works, it can be highly effective. So I think in the case of something like that, consider this Haskell code. If you submit that to ICFP, that is totally fine, because you can expect that the ICFP reviewer will know Haskell, and they will be able to follow what you're talking about right away. At some other conferences that are somewhat broader, or where you really don't know what kind of background people will have, I find this often doesn't work. It also doesn't work for sort of some more formal work where there's no crisp, concrete example that you can start with right off the bat. But if it does work, it's very effective. Okay. Any questions so far? Yeah.
Jumping back a bit, but
Yeah.
I often struggle with the interaction between top-down and just-in-time. Just to jump back.
Yes.
Trying to,
Oh, wait back. Okay. Yeah, sorry.
trying to introduce stuff.
Yeah.
Then you realise, oh, I need to tell them about this technical thing. But you want to try and...
I'm going to be getting to this point in just a minute.
Okay, good. It's the whole point of
I don't know how to have a completely compelling answer, but I'm going to get to this point. Thank you. So key ideas. So for me, the key ideas section is the most distinctive thing about me. So every paper has an intro, every paper has related work, every paper has technical stuff. Not every paper has a key ideas section. And so that's the thing that's most distinctive about this structure that I'm advocating. So what is a key idea section? Basically, a key idea section is where you've just explained your contribution and hopefully made the reader interested in learning more about what you did. But you don't want to launch right into the technical details because that's going to be too hard to understand. So this key idea section bridges the intro and the actual technical description of what you did. And the best way I think of thinking about what you are trying to achieve in this section is it's as if you're at the whiteboard and you're trying to explain to someone in 10 minutes on the whiteboard what is the main idea of what you did. Okay, so when you explain things to the whiteboard, you don't start proving theorems, you don't start even stating theorems. You start with examples. You start with concrete examples that illustrate the ideas. Maybe you start with pictures. You give high-level intuition. You don't have to show the general solution to your problem. That's what the technical section is for. This is just to get them the basic idea of what you're doing. And so you may ask, why bother? Okay, I mean, is it really necessary? Can't I think that they're reviewers for a conference like ICFP. They know their stuff anyway. No. This is useful for several reasons. One is it forces you to have a takeaway. I find if I don't try the best I can to have a key idea section, I often just, the paper will become sort of this diffuse thing, where there's no central thing that the reader can take away. Simon likes to refer to this as kind of the ping of the paper, or similarly with the talk. What is the thing that's sort of the light bulb that goes off in their head? So it forces you to try to at least have a takeaway. And also, many readers of your paper do not want to know the technical details. They just want to know the takeaway. So you should give them a section which only describes things at that higher level. Because certainly I know for myself, there's many papers I'd love to read. I don't have time to read them. I read very few papers in the fine technical detail. I often just read them quickly to get the rough idea of what's going on. And for those who do want the technical details, these key ideas are still useful as a kind of scaffolding, this kind of spiral model of learning that I described before. Okay, now having said that, I'm going to come back to your question. What's your name? Luke. I'm going to come back to something very close to your question, because I have to make a confession. I just told you you should have a key ideas section, but I don't always have a key ideas section. I realized this only recently, because I've been giving this talk a while, and I've always said you should have a key idea section. And at some point, I was looking over my recent papers, and I realized that, of the last, 10 papers, I think 2 of them had a key idea section. And so I thought, well, maybe I'm being a bit hypocritical here. What's going on? So I tried to figure out what's going on, and what's going on is basically this problem that you that you described before, of this sort of conflict between high level or top down and just in time. So the way I like to think about what is often the difficulty is the structure that I've advocated so far is a kind of breadth first traversal. So you have like a tree of stuff that you want to, it doesn't always fit nicely into a tree, but you know, again, this is just the basic idea. You have a bunch of things you want to talk about, and higher level in the tree means sort of higher level of abstraction. So you can think of what I've advocated so far as basically, you know, the intro is this sort of the thing at the top, that's the most high level. Then you have several key ideas that you want to get across. Those are 2, 3, and 4, and then each of those is supported by more technical detail that you present in the later sections. And so that's the ideal. So if you can make this work, it's great. But I found, unfortunately, that sometimes, quite often in fact, breadth first doesn't work so neatly. So for example, I often have several key ideas I want to talk about, and some of them really require, in order to understand even the key idea, they require first explaining at least some of the subtree, the technical subtree that's rooted at the first key idea. Okay. So what can you do about this? So the technique that I usually use is sort of a modified version of a key idea section, which I call layering. So it's hard to give a general recipe for how this should work, but I'll just give you an example from a paper I published recently at Poplar. So this is quite a technical paper on a new relaxed memory model for C++-like language, and it was we really could not figure out how you could just isolate the key ideas in some very high level way without getting into some details of this memory model, this new memory model we were defining. It just didn't work. Okay. So what do we do? So what could we do? Well, the solution was not to just launch into the memory model. Okay. So that's the full memory model that we ended up presenting later in the paper. Okay. That was the new language we were defining. Looks complicated, but if you've ever seen a paper on relaxed memory models, you may know that this is not so complicated by comparison to others. Anyway, but clearly we couldn't just like launch into this, right? That would be a total disaster. So that's what the reader would say. Okay. So instead, we use this idea of layering. So the idea was basically to present some of the ideas repeatedly, but in a kind of incremental fashion. So in the intro, we wrote, we explained the contributions, and we wrote a few paragraphs about the main key idea. That would be like the equivalent of the idea 2, label 2 on the earlier slide. Right, so that was sort of like the most important key idea. Then, in the section 2, which is where you would ordinarily hope to find the key idea section, we had more details about that main key idea, but with some technical details, okay? But we did not present that full-blown formal definition that you saw on the previous slide. Instead, we presented a drastically cut-down version of the semantics that was just enough to explain that one key idea, okay? And this is, you can see it up there at the top. It may not look totally simple, but it's like way more simple than the ultimate thing. And then in the subsequent sections, we kept adding features to this model, incrementally building out to that big thing, and also presenting these other key ideas, which were now you could talk about the other key ideas because you had at least this simplified version of the memory model in your brain. Okay. So that's how we get around it, and I end up doing this kind of layering in a lot of my papers if they don't have a key idea section. And you may ask, well, does it work? Well, I mean, it worked. It got, the paper got reviews that said things like it's extremely well written and the presentation of the semantics is well motivated and understandable. Probably because those reviewers have read a bunch of other papers on weak memory models and they thought, those papers, my head exploded. So here, it wasn't easy, but you could follow it if you tried. So, it passed. Now, having said this, a question that someone has given me at previous PLMWs was, well, that's all well and good to have this key idea section or this layering, but what if I don't have enough space, right? Because this kind of a layered presentation actually does take space. You're explaining the same thing over and over again. You're explaining it. You're adding additional technical material, right? This sort of cut down version of the semantics that takes space. What if I don't have enough space? Well, I would say there's two things you can do. One is move some technical details to an appendix. Don't think you have to present all the technical details of your paper in the paper. It's fine to move some really detailed things to an appendix, and someone who really wants to understand them will read that. Even then, it can be difficult to make this work within the space of certain of papers in certain conferences, because some conferences have much smaller page limits. And my advice there is, frankly, submit to a conference with a higher page limit. In my experience, the best conferences in the field of PL have reasonable page limits. Conferences like ICFP, any of the SIGPlan conferences, PLDI, and UPSLA also have very reasonable page limits. And there's other conferences as well that, ESOP, for example, is very reasonable page limit. There's other smaller conferences that often have these smaller page limits, and I found it's just impossible to write a good paper for these conferences. So that's my advice. Okay, enough about key ideas. I focused on it a lot because I think that's really that's the way to make your paper different from a lot of other papers.
Derek, I have a quick
Yes.
question. So, my experience has been that the more examples I put in the paper, the happier the reviewers are.
Yes.
How do you relate key ideas with examples?
Well, as I said before, examples are essential to a key idea section. That's what a key idea section is. You're presenting these concrete examples to give the reader, that's how you explain a key idea, through examples. And that was the same in this paper, by the way. It was all example driven. The entire presentation was example driven. We gave some formal details to sort of explain how does this program run under this semantics, right? But it was all driven by concrete examples. Okay. Related work. So I have very little to say about related work. It's a section you need to have in a paper. People will definitely expect it. Many people will read it. My basic comments are, one, it should go at the end of the paper. So a lot of people put their related work at the beginning of the paper after the intro. This is just getting in the way of the key idea section, right? The reader at that point is not really ready to understand how your work relates to the related work, because in order to understand that, they have to understand what you did. So it really just belongs at the end of the paper. At that point, you've actually explained all your technical details, and you can do a proper comparison. This doesn't mean, by the way, that you can't talk about some related work in your introduction, or in other places in the paper. It's fine to, when you're explaining a gap in the introduction, or the thing what is the problem that other work doesn't solve, obviously at that point you should mention some related work. But that's not what the related work section is about. The related work section is about detailed technical comparisons with other papers. And that's something you can only do at the end. The other thing is just you should give real comparisons. Don't just say, the classic thing is a laundry list where you just sort of say, oh, I really need to cite these people, so I cite their paper and say what sort of rewrite their abstract as a paragraph. The reader does not want to see that. Okay, it really pisses me off when I read papers like that, and it makes me think, well, they didn't really care about doing a proper comparison. Okay, any questions so far? So that's what I have to say about papers. So if you have questions about papers, any more questions? Yeah.
I suppose this is a really minute thing, but acknowledgements, sometimes you see them at the start, sometimes you see them at the end. Is there a general...
Oh, acknowledgements.
Yeah.
Yeah, I usually put them at the end.
Does it make a difference? Or is it just...
Well, so these days with submissions, most of our conferences are double blind, so you're not even allowed to acknowledge people. Well, yeah, basically, during the submission, but yeah, at the end. Yeah.
When you're talking about explaining how the existing solutions don't bridge the gap,
Yeah.
and you should mention related work, sometimes there is lots and lots and lots of related work.
That's a very good question, yes.
Is it better to sort of keep it slim or try and...
Well, it depends. If you really need to present, you don't want to spend too much time on it. But it depends on the paper. So you try to get by with as little as possible. Or maybe there would be several different approaches that are kind of all in the same, you could put them into one bag. And you can say, well, all these approaches have a similar problem, even though they all have that problem in somewhat different ways. But this takes some finessing. But yeah, you generally want to say you want to get to your intro to your contributions, right? So yeah, I don't know how to give a better. I'm not sure if I can give a better answer than that, but no. Okay. All right. Great. So that was writing papers. So let's say you've taken my advice and now you've written a paper, sent it to ICFP, gets in, you're all very excited. Then it comes time to actually give the talk, to prepare the talk. When I prepare talks, I have in mind a very positive thing, which is that the audience will look like this. Okay, they will all look up at me and they will all think, oh wow, this is really great work, and oh, it's such a great speaker and everything. And I will have this ability to communicate directly with the masses, right, in a way that when you're writing a paper you don't, right? If people just read your paper individually, a lot more people can hear about your work at a conference like this one than are likely to actually read your paper. So that looks all great. But unfortunately, the reality is often that they look a bit more like this, especially on the third day of the conference. And if your talk is lucky enough to be scheduled in the afternoon like this one, then they might look like this. So how can you avoid that? One approach, or certainly one piece of good advice that you'll find in a number of talks, including Simon's talk. He has also a great talk on giving a research talk, and John Hughes had a really great talk on speaking skills at PLMW last year. Is the idea that the way you prevent them from falling asleep is you entertain them, right? You make your talk exciting. You wake them up. Your best weapon is your enthusiasm. You put on a show. And I think this is, obviously this is something to strive for, but my personal feeling is that it's hard to teach people to be entertaining. And most researchers, God love them, they're not so entertaining. And it's not something that I haven't figured out how you teach this to people. Also, I worry about if you try to tell someone they'll make things entertaining, they'll try to put in bad jokes or something. And, I don't know, it can go off the rails. So I'm not going to exactly suggest to entertain your audience. Instead, I want to start by thinking about sort of how is a conference talk different from a paper? So, on the one hand, as I've said already, right, the positive thing is there's a lot more people looking at it. A lot more people paying attention to you. A lot more people learning about your work. So that's great. For me, that's about the only positive thing about giving a talk. Otherwise, as a form of communicating ideas, I think you can often do this more precisely or have more lasting impact with the paper. So what are some of the specific things that are different about how audiences perceive what you're doing when they listen to your conference talk as opposed to reading your paper? Any ideas? Yeah.
Probably only be able to present about 10% of the material.
Yes, that's one of them. Yeah. Yeah.
People don't have time to sit down and read the same part over and over again if that makes sense.
Exactly, they can easily get lost, yes.
And you get a chance to actually see where they got lost.
You mean in a talk you have a chance?
In a talk, yeah. Once you see the eyes rolling at the back.
I see. Yes, that's true. Yes. Anything else? Okay, so those are two of the three reasons that I wrote down. So you can't say much. That was the first thing someone said. People will easily get lost. And the third one, which I have listed second here, is that typically when people read your paper, they've already made a little bit of an upfront investment that they printed out your paper. They actually want to read it, or they'd like to get something out of it. With a talk, that is definitely not the case, right? You're giving a talk at a conference. It's 3 days long. There's 50, 60 talks. The audience is interested in a general topic, let's say a functional programming, but for any given talk, right, there's probably only a handful of people in the audience who are really excited about the topic of that talk. So you have to make the audience care in a way that you don't quite have to do as much in a paper. So I'm going to focus on, I'm going to talk about all three of these things and how you can mitigate them. So the first one is, you can't say much, right? There's much less information you can convey in a 20-minute talk than in a 12-page paper. By the way, I realized that 12 pages was for the old style of ICFP formatting, the 2-column. Now it's like double the length. Just occurred to me. Right, so this is a paper structure that I've described that I think works. What do you think you would have to do if you're turning this into a talk? Let's say you've written a paper that follows this structure. Yeah.
Remove the technical meat.
Okay. Yeah. Anything else? Remove related work. Okay. Anything else? Well, the abstract. Okay. There's no abstract in the talk usually. So I remove. Basically, you remove almost the whole thing. Right. All you have left is intro and key ideas. That's basically all you should think about putting into your talk. Sometimes you can give a little related work, maybe, if you have time. But it's really not essential, and people aren't necessarily expecting it. Again, they probably will be expecting related work insofar as you have to explain your gap, right? So as we said before, the kind of related work discussion that you would find in an intro, that's fine, but not a detailed comparison with related work section. So yeah, I typically have just to give you a rough idea, I typically have an intro that's like 8 minutes for a 20-minute talk. I have an intro that's 8 minutes, key idea section that's 11 minutes, and then so that's only 19. You're thinking you can't count. So then there's 1 minute for what else is in the paper. So because I often feel kind of bashful, like I've only explained this like tiny little bit of what's in my paper, I have 1 minute at the end where I say, well, in case you thought this seemed like a rather slim paper, there's also all this bunch of other stuff that's really exciting, and go read the paper for that. Okay, so that's the basic idea for, in my opinion, for how you should structure a talk. Second issue, right, that the audience may or may not care. What is the audience? What do you think the audience wants to know when you start your talk? Yeah.
What did you do and why does it matter?
What did you do and why does it matter? That's right. Okay. Well, so which of those questions comes first? The second one. Yeah. They don't really care about what you did until you tell them why it matters. They need to know, in short, what's your problem, right? You don't want to start out by telling them exactly what you did, right? You want to start by telling them what is the problem and why is it important, okay? So there's a difficulty, however, which is that often it takes a little while to explain the problem, the specific problem that you're trying to solve. And if you take too long to explain the problem, you'll often lose the audience. So this is a kind of this is a tricky point. So what I like to do is stage the motivation. This is kind of like I like to stage the motivation. I'll just say it like this. First, get to a problem, which is generally a more general version of the problem you're solving, and then get to the problem, which is a specific problem you're solving. And for the general part, like explaining what is the general problem you're solving and why people should care about it, I try to take at most 2 minutes. Right? People will give you 2 minutes, even if they're not necessarily interested in your talk. They'll listen to you for 2 minutes to see, is this talk worth listening to? And if you can first get to something that's a clear problem, maybe not exactly what you're doing, what you're solving, but a more general version of it, then they'll be willing to sit and pay attention for another 4 minutes while you get to the point of motivating and explicitly stating your specific problem. And notice 4 minutes more is not so much. So this is again a point where you have to limit that discussion of the prior work to just what you need in order to motivate the gap that you're addressing. I should say, by the way, again, as with intros, if you can follow this sort of Simon PJ approach of starting with a concrete motivating example right off the bat, that's great. All right. I mean, if you can make that work, it's great. It's just that in many cases, there's too much prior knowledge just to even write down what a motivating example would be. So that's why I say you should at least get to some problem in the first 2 minutes. Okay. The second question then is, what do you do, right? So the common mistake I find that people make here is they explain their problem very nicely, and then they start just talking about technical stuff, right? Or maybe they start moving into the key ideas, but they never state what they did. This happens a lot. You'll see this week. You listen to talks. You'll say, after they motivate the problem, then they'll just start talking about stuff, and you'll be like, what did you do? And so I recommend highly that after you've clearly stated your problem, then you have this sort of proud statement of like our contributions. And you have a slide which summarizes the contributions of your paper. And sort of gives so you're sort of telling the audience what they want to know. And then they're like, oh, okay, well, all right, now I'm interested in hearing how exactly this plays out. And for me, so after you've stated your contributions is what I like to think of as the end of the intro. And I like to follow that immediately with a crisp statement of the key idea. So this is kind of the transition point from the intro section to the key idea section. It's the high point of audience interest in the talk. They're really interested now, hopefully, if you've done it right. And now is the time to deliver the key idea in its most crisp, high-level form. And that will give the audience a takeaway message. They'll give a focus to the rest of your talk. I find this works very well. Okay. All right, so that was about the audience not caring. So the last one, which is a big one, is how do you prevent the audience from getting lost, right? And here's where, this is where these ideas from how to write a good paper come back into play, right? We already heard about, at the beginning of the talk, about how to prevent the reader of a paper from getting lost, and very similar ideas apply in the talk setting. So remember we had flow and coherence, right? Flow with old to new and coherence with one paragraph, one point. So how does that play out in a talk? So for flow, basically it's kind of the obvious thing. You know, if you write down a script, I mean, I'm not necessarily recommending you write out a full script for your talk, but if you want to detect whether you're having flow problems, write out a script for some slide, see if it follows old to new, right? If it doesn't, then, well, you're going to have a problem. Usually, however, that's not the main problem I find people have. Mostly people within one slide, you know, the ideas will follow old to new. The biggest problem is between slides. So a common thing that a lot of students do is they finish one slide, okay, that was perfectly followed old to new, then they just go, so, and then they continue on with the, you know, with the next slide. And that was the whole transition was so, and that's not enough, right? So you need to have a sort of meaningful transition, and ideally it's something you should plan to say during the transition, right? That's a good way of forcing yourself to have a transition that connects the two slides, is to actually say it during the transition. It also forces you to know what the next slide is going to be, right? I think a lot of the time people don't exactly remember what the next slide is going to be, and that's why they click to the next slide and then say, oh, so that's something you get with practice. So, so that was flow, right? So the other one is coherence. Obviously, it's not going to be one paragraph, one point anymore. Any idea what the new principle should be? One slide, one point. Yeah. Sorry. Right, because slides are kind of the paragraphs of your talk. So here's an example of a slide. This slide has various issues. Okay, but I like it as an example of coherence problems. So take a quick look at it. So, yeah, 5 minutes. So can anyone suggest what might be what is the issue with this slide? Oh, too much going on. Okay, specifically.
Automation and concurrency, and then state of the art, have 2 slides.
Yeah, I would have 2 slides, maybe 3 even, but probably 2. So I mean, the issue here is that yeah, this slide is just trying to convey too much information in one slide, and this is very natural, right? I mean, all the information seems to fit on one slide, right? I mean, that's what you want to say. What could be wrong? But the problem is that, yeah, if you look at the slide and you try to come up with a point sentence or a point, you know, some point for this one slide, you won't find one. Okay, there's at least 2 points. One is the point about that optimizations for sequential programs may not work for concurrent under concurrency, and then the other point is about, well, how do compilers deal with this? And those are 2 separate points. And if you put them on one slide, their heads will just go to mush, and they won't really be able to follow anything you're saying, and then they'll tune out very quickly. Also, if you put them on 2 slides, you can develop the points better. Right? You could actually explain, you could give an example of an optimization for sequential programs that's not valid under concurrency. You could give a bit more detail about the state of the art, etc. Okay, so one slide, one point. I'm going to skip over talklets just for time because I want to end on time. But basically, all I have to say about talklets is, I've described coherence at the level of an individual slide. You also want to have coherence over a whole talk, right? So if you have a long section of a talk, like the key ideas section, which is 10 minutes long, then you want to break that into little smaller pieces, which sort of make the story more digestible. These more digestible units of story. And you want to make sure that you use the transitions between those talklets, again, sort of pop up to the big picture and say what is, how they connect. Okay. So I want to just conclude with a few words about slide design. It doesn't quite fit into any of the problems that I mentioned so far, but obviously when you're trying to sit and design slides in your favorite tool, you think about slide design a lot. Now, I am no expert on slide design, okay? But the good news is, don't worry. It's okay if you're visually untalented like I am. You can still, the most important aspects of slide design have nothing to do with having good style, okay? They have to do with communicating information. And so to illustrate this, I'm just going to show you two sets of slides, okay, in slide sorter mode. And I want you to see what do you think about them, okay? I'm just going to show them for a few seconds, okay? Just give me your initial impression after I show both of them. Undergrad lecture slides, okay.
It's like you're revising sort of thing.
So without even looking at in detail at what's saying in the slide, I mean, that's why I put it in slide sort of mode. You're not really looking at what they say, just the look. How would you compare these two?
This concept is better
The second is better. Why?
because it has much more graphical information.
It has more graphical information, less text. What else? There's something else. That's one of them. What? Titles. Well, they are bigger, yes. But that's part of having less text is you have bigger text.
Can you
Yeah.
go back to the-
Oh, yeah, sorry. This one had titles that were just pretty small. But that's not, it's okay to have small titles. It's not the end of the world.
Just a great wall of text.
It's a great bullet text, but it's even, yeah. Yeah. So it may be hard to get the exact point I'm getting for. It's less varied, all right? So that's maybe what you mean when you say the big block of text, right? It's all the same thing, right? So there's a sameness that will fall over the viewer of the talk as you see slide after slide of text. And frankly, this will also be a problem if you have slide after slide with no text, right? I've gone, some people like these kind of talks that are just like, these sort of psychedelic things where it's like images floating at you. And personally, I can't stand these talks. I like a talk to have some mixture of different things. It sort of keeps you involved and not knowing exactly what's going to come next. So with this slide, yeah, actually this slide, I mean, these slides have some text, right? That one over there is all text. That's all text. This is all text, really. I mean, there's a lot of slides that are mostly, there's still mostly text. It's just it's being used in a more interesting visual where, you know, there's some attempt to have the point of the slide drive the form. Okay, and you know this takes time. There's no simple recipe for how to do this, and you could give a whole course on slide design, of course. But I just wanted to make those 2 points basically. The first was avoid PowerPointitis. Right, don't just put dumb text on your slides like you're giving a lecture. It's not important that your slides are readable independently of the talk. I think a lot of people, I know I have that tendency when I prepare slides. I'm like, I want the people who didn't go to the conference to be able to read my slides and know what I did. No, that's just that's not the right goal. They can read your paper. And then vary the look of the slides. Don't make them all look the same. Okay, so that's all I have to say, and hopefully some of these ideas you'll find useful, and let me know if you know. Thank you. Yeah. Simon.
I'd like to make one comment about the sort of key ideas and layering thing. You're saying sometimes it's not very easy to do the key ideas. You have to do the layering thing.
Yeah.
Just like to encourage everybody not to give up too early.
No, exactly.
Right? Because it's so productive. If you can't get the key ideas out, maybe it's because we haven't figured out what they are yet.
Yes.
It's incredibly helpful just to work hard at that.
Part of what
only get to the sort of plan B if you really, really, really can't.
I completely agree. I mean, and one reason I talk about this is just that I found it for myself, it's often difficult to have a standalone section that's like 1 or 2 pages like I'd like it to be. That's all the reader needs to know without getting into some details. What I do typically do, though, as in that example, is have a bit at the end, a few paragraphs at the end of the introduction at least, where some very abstract version of the key idea is described. So at least the reader has something to go on for the rest of the talk.
When it's you, I believe it. But I just encourage everybody here.
I mainly get this because some people have told me, like, well, I don't know how to think of key ideas here, and I realize it is often difficult, but you should definitely try to have the key ideas as much as you can. Yeah?
In that way, can you say that the name your baby approach, you could apply that to sort of phrases as well, like instead of naming...
Yeah, this is yes, I meant that as for terms more generally, right? So not just one word, but for all phrases, or for... It often even forces you to think about what are the common things that occur in your paper that you want to refer to over and over again, and you don't want to say like some long-winded thing. Maybe you want to give it a name, like I don't know, HTS or I don't know what it is, but something, some acronym for whatever. Give it a name. Don't just refer to it as the type system that does blah blah blah. Yeah, really.
Would you advocate for fun, jokey titles or the
No.
Every module,
Well, I mean,
every
not
module
unless you know what you're
one?
doing. You have to be careful. I mean, yes. I've had some mildly jokey titles. Oh, okay, I've had one very jokey title. You can ask me about that at whiskey. But generally speaking, unless you know what you're doing, I don't recommend doing terribly jokey titles. On the other hand, I also don't recommend doing boring titles, right? So, the title, it's funny, in one of the versions of this talk, I wanted to have a whole section on titles, and I thought, like, okay. Titles, actually, on this, the thing with the structure of a research paper, that's actually where I wanted to have it, right? The first thing is actually the title. Like, okay, the abstract maybe is read by 1,000 readers, the title will be read by like 10,000. Maybe not 10,000, but whatever. It's read by a lot more people than will even read your abstract. And so actually coming up with a good title is great. I unfortunately have no very clear advice for how to do this, except my students usually leave it to me because I can't get excited about a paper unless I have the title that I'm sort of interested in. But yeah, that's hard. Any other questions? Yeah.
This is probably contextually dependent, but the temptation to typeset slides in LaTeX is really, really tempting sometimes to just scan your code.
Yeah, I don't recommend it. I allow my students to do it if they know how to make it look less LaTeX-y. So, I mean, the problem, to be less jokey about it, there's one real problem with LaTeX, which is you can't do seamless transitions. You know, you can give a good talk without seamless transitions. I've given many talks that I think were perfectly good without them. But I find that they help when especially when you're explaining things visually. It often really helps to say, okay, here's this thing, and now we're going to move this over here, and then you make more space. And I find it frees me up a lot when I'm preparing talks. So I use Keynote now all the time at least for talks. Certainly for talks that are not like super technical. If I'm giving an hour-long technical talk for a specialized audience, I will happily use LaTeX, because then I know there's going to be a lot of math. But that's a different thing. I've been focusing today on conference talks, which are the most important talks that you're going to give. That's the biggest audience, and that's when you want to put your focus, your biggest focus. Yeah.
So this is both sort of the writing papers and giving talks, but when you do some work that's based on somebody else's paper, and you find yourself needing to recall some definitions or theorems or something that they've laid out, is it better to just say in your writing, you should read this paper and then learn all about it, or just repeat?
You can't tell people to just read another paper. I mean, okay, people do this, right? But I don't recommend it. Your paper should be self-contained. Certainly, if you're referring to the other paper for sort of like background that you need in order to understand what you're saying,
If your paper is like literally based on,
then you got to spend some time reviewing that paper. I have often spent time with some earlier sections in a paper. It's kind of an instance of this layering technique. I'll often, if I really need to explain some previous ideas in order to explain what my key ideas are, then I will have a whole section where I try to explain those previous ideas at a high level using a concrete motivating example that I'm going to build on in my key ideas. Right? Again, making it as concrete as possible. You don't want to have just this boring technical presentation of regurgitating someone else's paper. You want to make it as focused as possible on what the reader needs to know in order to understand your key idea.
Is it okay to then sort of say, see this paper for more?
Yeah, I mean, certainly if it's just about, you can always cite other papers for additional information that's not directly needed for what you're saying. That's fine. But if like your key ideas will be incomprehensible without the reader going to some other paper, you're toast. Yeah.
I feel like some research problems don't necessarily fit into, or some research doesn't fit into that group candidate.
Yeah.
Sort of.
For example?
For example, I read a paper recently on sort of bridging a kind of connection between these sort of subfields in a larger field. How would you sort of go about presenting that? Do you sort of want the context of both?
Well, you have to say something about both of them and how, but you have to, so the temptation that a student would typically have is to say, well, okay, I need to have a section on the first subfield, and then I need to have a section on the second subfield, and then I can explain what I'm doing. Well, I mean, you may need to have such sections, but you should not just have a section where you completely summarize the subfield, right? You should only summarize the bit of information about that subfield that's relevant to understanding how you're going to be combining it with the other subfield, right? And this is, I mean, to be honest, this is hard. There's no, this takes a lot of work even. I mean, when I'm writing papers, I often have to rewrite and rewrite. So, okay. But that's, you just want to, again, as little as possible to get to your key idea. Yes?
This is a question, it's more like, the thing I like doing with regards to this is, if I'm focusing on X and we say Y and Z, I'll start with X and then bring in Y and then say how it relates back to X by giving that code example. sort of introduce bits as you go along. I don't know if that's a good way of doing it, but that's why I think it's a good way to introduce bits and
Yes.
explain into the problem.
I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah.
How many of your suggestions can be applied to lecture slides and talks because they are different from?
Well, certainly flow and coherence apply to lecture slides. I mean, I think obviously a lecture is a different structure. Well, my personal feeling is ideally they would all apply to lecture slides. It's just that generally when you're preparing lecture slides you have less time. You know, and there's a smaller audience, and the audience they bought into the fact that you're teaching a class, so you don't have to convince them that they should be sitting there necessarily. But depending on the situation, if it's an advanced class or something, you have students who are dedicated. If it's not an advanced class, then yeah.
I'd like to advocate that you not give lectures with slides.
That's another.
It's far more effective way of keeping your audience's attention.
So I agree to an extent.
Depends on the yes.
I've done both, and there's pluses and minuses. If you don't give slides, then sometimes it can get a little slower. I know that inevitably I screw things up all the time, which is okay. It's nice to show students that you screw things up all the time, but it can get, I mean, I don't know, there's pluses and minuses. I won't, we can talk offline, but. One last question, yeah.
In the spirit of illustrative examples, what's one paper the best thing you've ever read?
Well, okay. I won't say the best paper I've ever read, but one of the best papers I've ever read is Peter O'Hearn's paper on concurrent separation logic. It's called Resources, Concurrency, and Local Reasoning. And it is, it's a little unfair to say that this is one of the best papers, because this is not, I mean, this doesn't fit into it. So well, I guess it was ultimately a conference paper, but it's not quite, he kind of has a benefit, I don't know what the word is. So he was presenting concurrent separation logic just by examples, and that's what makes the paper great. Okay, he's presenting a new logic just by examples. There is no soundness proof in the paper. The soundness, he didn't actually have the soundness proof. Brooks came up with the soundness proof, and that was written in a separate paper, which was published at the same time, and so it was kind of an unusual situation. But as a result, there's like very little gory technical details. I mean, there's technical details of the examples, but it's all example driven. It's all intuition driven. It's all key idea driven, and it's just beautifully written. I'm not going to say it's my favorite paper of all time, but it's certainly one of the best papers I know on I've ever read on formal verification. Okay. Thanks.